Have you ever sat and stared up at the stars and wondered, where did we come from? Let's take a journey like no other, not to a place, but to a time. Join us as we delve deep into the human past and explore our shared human origins. Welcome to the world of paleoanthropology. Hello, everyone. This is Seth from the world of paleoanthropology, and today we are here with another episode of The Story of Us with a great guest, Dr. Bernard Wood, and from GW University, George Washington, and I'm so glad that he is here with us today, and I wanted to hand it over so he could introduce himself.
Hi, Seth. Hi, everybody. My name is Bernard Wood. I am a paleoanthropologist who was initially trained as a doctor, as a medical doctor, and then a surgeon. And because of my interest in anatomy and the opportunity to go and work with Richard Leakey, in 1968, I eventually left medicine and surgery and became a full-time academic. I worked in the UK at the University of London and then the University of Liverpool before coming to the US in 1997. And my main interest is in trying to make sense of the hominin fossil record in terms of how many taxa are represented, how many species are represented, and how those species are related.
And that is so fascinating. And it just quickly relates to the last episode that we had. I don't know if I remember mentioning it to you or not. We had your just now received his PhD student, Ryan McRae, now Dr. Ryan McRae, and learning just more about your work from talking to him. And I actually first saw one of your lectures in person at, I wish it was a more happy occasion, but the Bill Kimball inaugural lecture in Arizona at ASU. Just hearing you speak in person really was enthralling, and it made me really want to get you on the show. And again, I just wish it was for a happier occasion. So, you mentioned you switched over from being a physician, a surgeon, to a academic, an anthropologist. And what I know of a lot of people that perhaps make that switch the opposite way. But what was it like going from a medical background to studying human evolution?
Well, it was the motives for the switch were complex. I always enjoyed anatomy. When I was at high school, the topic that interested me most the topics were history and geography. But I had none of my family had been to college, so I had no experience of what you might do if you went to university, as we would call it in the UK. And my parents had a grocery store, and I used to deliver groceries on a bicycle. When I delivered groceries to accountants, I was not impressed by them. When I delivered groceries to lawyers, I wasn't particularly impressed by them. But I used to deliver groceries to a cardiologist and a community pediatrician, and they were unfailingly kind to me and used to give me a glass of lemonade in the summer and sixpence. So I decided that I would be a doctor. Not the greatest reason in the world, but that's what I did. But once I had the opportunity to get involved in paleoanthropology, and I should say I'm not one of those people that spent their childhood in a natural history museum. My parents had no interest in such things, and I had therefore no interest in such things. And so I was really ignorant about human evolution when I was a medical student, but I did an extra degree, um, and that gave me an exposure to primatology
Mm.
with John Napier and to paleoanthropology with Michael Day. And I found the application of my anatomical expertise to trying to work out what these bones meant really appealing. And I, um, I think if you're going to be a surgeon, it needs to be for the reason that you really couldn't do anything else. And I wasn't of that sort of, I
Mhm.
wasn't of that persuasion. And so I decided to teach anatomy to medical students and to trainee surgeons as my contribution. And my research has always been, well, nearly always, most of my research has been related to paleoanthropology.
And you mentioned that you focus on determining how many taxa there are and who belongs where necessarily. How did that become what interested you versus other topics in the field?
Well, that became what interested me because um, after going to what was then Lake Rudolf in 1968, Richard Leakey invited me to be one of the people who to describe the fossils that he was finding.
Mhm.
And and the fossils that uh, there were three of us who were invited: Michael Day, Alan Walker, and myself. Um, Neither of them wanted to tackle the cranial material, of which was most of the fossil record. Largely because Alan Walker was interested in locomotion, and Michael Day had worked on the postcranial fossils from Olduvai Gorge. So, but the only thing I knew really much about was the talus, which is a foot bone that I had done for my honours thesis for my bachelor science in anatomy. So we all wanted to work on the postcranial material. Richard Leakey was very frustrated, and he went into the bathroom of his hotel in New York, where we were all meeting to try and thrash this out, and he broke up three matches of different lengths. And to cut a long story short, I drew the shortest match and therefore was given the cranial remains. And the and unlike the cranial remains at some sites, like Chikuti in in China or maybe or Hadar in Ethiopia, it was clear that there were the remains of not just one, but maybe two and maybe even more hominins. And the initial task I had was to sort these out. And that was my interest in that was determined by the task that I was given.
So the unexpected event of getting the shortest match
Which is
ended up
indeed.
creating your
Mm.
passion. That's amazing. That it's ironic how that can happen for sure. What was your do you think your biggest surprise in this new passion? Like, was there something that you went in thinking that was just wrong, what that you discovered?
Um, I'm not sure I was ever. Um, I'm not sure I had enough confidence to think that things were actually wrong. In some ways, being trained in medicine
Mhm.
was a good training. Somebody once said that the medical training is wasted on doctors. Um, thing about the medical training is that you do anatomy and physiology and biochemistry. You end up, you know, knowing a little about a lot of things,
Right.
which which is helpful in some way. Um, Yeah, there was nothing that, there was no great insight. I mean, I think also a training in medicine and surgery was beneficial, because one of the things that you're taught is that uh, there are lots of cases, lots of people where you can't be sure what's wrong with them.
Hmm.
There is, you know, there are some things that are more likely, there are some things that are less likely, but you can't just decide, they have diabetes and then, you know, and then ignore um, evidence that suggests that they might have tuberculosis or something else. And so I think that the, the notion of not having to be right was actually a good training for paleoanthropology.
That's
You
definitely
you try
something
to be as right as you
yeah,
can, or
of
you
course.
or you try not to be wrong. Um, but there is quite often no clear answer, and you have to rank the possibilities in terms of likelihood. Um, and I think that medical training was good for that.
Absolutely. And for those who may be a little less um, up on their history, the history of paleoanthropology and everything, where was Richard working and where was the area he invited you to?
Um, well, at the time, this was 1968. He had been leading the Kenyan um, the, the Kenyan contribution to the international Omo research expedition, which went to the lower Omo Valley, and the Omo River drains into the northern end of what was then called Lake Rudolf. It's now called Lake Turkana, and um, the area that the Kenyans, and therefore Richard, was given to explore in the Omo was not very productive. And as he was going backwards and forwards between Nairobi and the Omo, he realized that there were a lot more promising looking exposures of sediments in northern Kenya along the east side of Lake Rudolf that was. And so that's why he decided in 1960, at the end of the field season in 1967, to say goodbye to the lower Omo and go and explore the sediments in the exposures in northern Kenya on the east side of Lake Rudolf. And you have to realize that at that time, the only really productive early hominin site in
Mhm.
Eastern Africa was Olduvai Gorge, and that most attention for most time have been focused, or since 1925, have been focused on the hominins being recovered from the cave sites in southern Africa.
Right, right.
So although now, it seems obvious there are so many productive sites in Eastern Africa, it wasn't so obvious in 1968. And in 1968, the only hominins, the only early hominins known from Eastern Africa were Homo habilis and Ginjanthropus boisea
Mhm.
from Olduvai. Um, and so it's it's important to try and put oneself back in what things were like in 1968. And our science is not very good at doing that. It tends to be use the present to try and interpret the past, and you need to think that the past was not just a sort of sort of klutzy version of the present, and b, what people did in 1968 and the decisions they made were made in the light of what was known in 1968, not
Right,
what we knew now.
absolutely. And so what do you think in our evolutionary thinking, on human evolutionary thinking, has changed the most since then?
Well, I think um, I'm not sure what has changed the most. Um, I think in terms of early hominin evolution,
Hmm.
I'm not talking about the later fossil record where the impact of ancient DNA has clearly been really profound. In early hominin evolution, I think, and this is probably not, you know, I'm not in the majority here, that one of the most important developments has been discovering how modern humans are related to the great apes.
Hmm.
And now we know on the basis of morphology and molecular evidence, both DNA and evidence from proteins, that modern humans are more closely related to, well, chimpanzees and bonobos are more closely related to each other than to any other great ape. And let's include humans as a great ape for
Hmm.
this discussion. Um, and then um, chimpanzees and bonobos are more closely related to modern humans than they are to gorillas. Now, I always say to the undergraduates, this would come as a bit of a shock to the chimpanzees and bonobos and gorillas because they're all in a zoo and modern humans drive to the zoo and walk around the zoo eating ice cream. Um, and
Yeah.
so it, it, it is a, a profound discovery to know that we are more closely related to chimpanzees and bonobos than, um, than gorillas. And that
Mhm.
has all sorts of implications for how you interpret morphology. Um, and I tend to be, a bit of a skeptic. I mean, some people, I think, when they find early hominins, they assume that they are an ancestor of modern humans
Right.
until proved otherwise. My my preference is to assume that they are a close relative and not necessarily an ancestor until you prove otherwise.
I see. That's definitely, I like, I think it's definitely a safer approach and definitely doesn't, I think there's a theme of people, scientists, researchers wanting species to be our ancestors. Like you said, there's an assumption, but I think there's also a well, my fossils are ancestors, so mine's more important, or something like some hubris in that way a little bit in some researchers. So I think the idea that, yeah, maybe they could be, but perhaps we need a little more evidence to prove they are first. And I think that's a really good way of looking at it. Um, when when would you say researchers first started to, in your experience, realize this? You said this. I asked when the change. What was the change?
Okay.
When did it occur?
Well, I think, for a long time, there was fossil hominins were sort of assembled on a ladder. The older ones were closer to the bottom of the ladder. The younger ones were closer to the top. And the ladder went from the common ancestor that we shared with um, whatever. Now we know it's chimpanzees and bonobos, but when I was a student, it was assumed that chimpanzees and bonobos were more closely related to gorillas than any of those three were to modern humans, and that they were probably more closely related to orangutans
Hmm.
than than to than to modern humans. Um, and when you only had a relatively few hominins recognized from the hominin fossil record, and most of the hominin fossil record wasn't close to the common ancestor. In other words, hominins looked um, sort of reliably different from apes. Um, the tendency was to put these in a sort of ladder-like way. The closer to the bottom of the ladder, the more ape-like you were, and the closer to the top of the ladder, the more modern human-like you were. The discovery, I think, that was really crucial was the discovery that Homo habilis and Zinjanthropus boisei, as it was called then, lived together, whatever together means. I mean,
Right.
Could be 1,000 years or 10,000 years, but they lived at broadly the same time in geological time, and the application of potassium argon dating to the ashes, the ashes in the sediments at Olduvai, which resulted in really an age that nobody would have really predicted. They were close to 2 million years. So if these two creatures were living alongside each other just before 2 million years ago, and they were so different, then there must have been more than one lineage. There was more than one ladder. And once there is more than one lineage or more than one ladder, there might be several.
Mm-hmm.
And so you have to work out which of these hominins is more likely to be an ancestor of modern humans. It's in many ways easier to identify creatures that are less likely. In other words, Zinjanthropus boisei, that's now called Paranthropus boisei, really is it's a bizarre creature, which if we hadn't found the fossils for it, no matter of wishful thinking would have ever come up with the notion that an early hominin looking like this existed. And so once that happened, it really made the ladder-like interpretation, just no longer sensible. Now, I tend to divide hominins into more species than other people, largely because I think it's easier to combine species than it is to split an inclusive species. But I have no, I know, a reasonable amount about this stuff, but I have no particular confidence that my interpretation is correct.
Mm-hmm.
I think it's less incorrect than some other interpretations, but I have no illusion that I don't necessarily think it's correct, and you'd be completely daft if you did.
So then, does the work never end on building those taxa and who belongs where and discovering new fossils?
The work never ends for several reasons. One is there are new fossils which cause the new fossils have to be consistent with your taxonomic hypothesis, and the new fossils are in a sense a test of that. And the other thing is that methods we have lots of new methods. So for example, the use of imaging methods to collect information about the internal structure of the hominin fossils means that even the existing fossils can provide you with new information. And so you have new information from new fossils, you have new information that you collect from the existing fossil record. Both of those things, with the addition of microstructure, which was never an issue in the earlier, in the early history of paleoanthropology, Um, these, these give us much more information. They don't give us enough information to be correct. And one of the reasons is that the hominin fossil record, all we know of the hominin fossil record, comes from the locations where hominins were living, where they were fossilized, and then their fossils are subsequently exposed and collected by scientists. Now, that doesn't mean that where we find fossils is the only place that hominins were living. That would be daft. And it also means that because of that, there is a lot of Africa. And I mean, I think it's pretty clear now that that Africa has to be the origin of hominins because of our close relationship between modern humans and the bonobos and the chimpanzees. And so we know about hominin evolution from a very small percentage of the African continent. And to assume that every important event in hominin evolution is captured by the fossil record, which we have of hominins from Eastern and Southern Africa, I think is also daft. I mean, it's just, sort of flies in the face of common sense. I mean, if I don't know where you're speaking from, but I'm not that far from New York. And if you tried to characterize New York on the basis of information from a couple of locations in New York, you would end up with a very strange view of New York, which would be erroneous. And so I'm not saying, we know so little of that, we should just give up. I'm saying that we should be realistic about the evidence that we have. And I think there are some people who just, are just sort of much too optimistic about the power of the evidence that we have. And I think, it's as well to be humility, I think, is one of the, the biggest requirements. And I'm really sort of distressed when I read hyperbolic descriptions of things like saying, this is the most important discovery, in human history, or
Right.
this is going to change the way we think. No, it's not. And the solution is going to come from people like the early paleoanthropologists that I had the privilege to meet, people like von Koenigswald, Richard Leakey, Philip Tobias, Raymond Dart. I never had the privilege of meeting Davidson Black and Franz Weidenreich, but these people did remarkable work given the methods that they had and the evidence that they had. And Winston Churchill was talking in the middle of the Second World War, at a very bad time in the Second World War, about the death of Neville Chamberlain, who had preceded him as Prime Minister. And he was making the point that it's really too early to judge what history should make of Neville Chamberlain. And he described sort of history as moving with a flickering lamp through the past. And the nature of the flickering lamps changes. Now we have DNA analysis and really sophisticated imaging analysis and sophisticated ways to gather information about the external morphology of fossils, but it's still a flickering lamp.
Hmm.
And, the flickering lamp's going to change and there are going to be developments in that, but, it's still a flickering lamp. And I think we should all realize that. And you
Uh,
can see from the color of my hair that I've been doing this a long time. And, I think I know less now than I did 30 years ago. I mean, that doesn't mean that we haven't made advances, but my assessment of what we knew then was a lot more bold and confident than my assessment now. But I think it's a really exciting time to be in paleoanthropology. I wish I was starting my career now, but it's, the methods are sort of complex and it's very difficult for me to keep up. It needs young and much more agile minds than mine. The only thing I can bring is experience.
well, that definitely has its
Mm,
place, as
mm,
I'm sure you well know.
mm.
So, going back a little towards the start of your anthropological career, when you switched from a physician again to an academic and anthropologist, what was it like going from the doctor's office or the operating room to the field work?
Well, you should understand that although I have worked in the field, I
Mhm.
am not a field worker.
That was a question I was going to ask. Yes.
There, there are people like my much lamented friend Bill Kimball who were happiest in the field and they loved doing it. As far as I was concerned, um, the time I spent in the field was actually time that was keeping me away from the laboratory where I was looking at the fossils. And, you know, without people like Bill and without people like Tim White and without um, those people, somebody like me wouldn't have anything to do. So I'm a parasite really on um, the 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 hard work, and it really is hard work of
Hmm.
working in the field and finding fossils. And I'm deeply conscious of that. And I'm very grateful for Richard Leakey to have given me the opportunity to go to the field, to get some grasp of what it's like. I think there are people who look at early hominin fossils who have never been exposed to field work, um, who have really no idea about what it's like. So, so if you are, you know, I'm not a field worker, and my my interest was that somebody said, Bob Martin, I think, said, there are hard sciences and there are soft sciences, and then there are sciences like paleontology, which are just um, difficult sciences because you're asking questions. You you you're very very tempted, to want to know answers to questions for which there is probably, based on the fossil record, no no unequivocal answer. Now, there are examples where uh, something like something like Paranthropus boisei is really distinctive. I mean, you only have to look at a flake of enamel from a post-canine tooth, a Paranthropus boisei, to know it's not Homo,
Right.
um, because the whole thing grows in a different way. And um, so, so there are some things that you can sort of rely on, but then there are a whole bunch of things that you can't really rely on.
Absolutely. And I think that's a very important note. A lot of people going into the field need to keep in mind, people my age and everyone who's just starting along. Um, what was or has been the highlight of your career
Oh,
so far?
I mean, I don't think there is a highlight. one of the things that I feel very strongly is that science is a social activity.
Hmm.
Uh, I do not like working on my own. I spent a long time working on my own on the Koobi Fora monograph, which was an attempt to make sense of the craniodental evidence from East Rudolf, which is now known as Koobi Fora. I really like working with other people, and I really like working with students and postdocs and colleagues. Um, but the secret to that is to always find people who are students and postdocs and colleagues who are smarter than you are. And so what I really enjoy is trying to use those sort of collaborations to reduce our ignorance. There isn't a sort of, eureka moment. And there are times uh, on the very few occasions that people ask for my advice. Well, actually, there are quite a lot of occasions where they ask for my advice, but there aren't many occasions when I'm really tempted to offer advice. But I think, I think people are either short-term people or long-term people.
Hmm.
Short-term people, if you're a surgeon, it's a short-term sort of job. Somebody comes to the clinic, you think you can help them, you operate and you do help them, and that's fantastic. But then there are long-term things like paleontology, where there is no instant gratification. And the thing about being a paleontologist and the thing about being an academic is that days and weeks and sometimes months go by and nothing really happens. You have no inspiration. You just have to keep sort of grinding away. So I think you need to decide whether you're a short-term person or a long-term person. I think it's miserable if you're a long-term person in a short-term job, and I think it's equally
Hmm.
miserable if you're a short-term person in a long-term job. And I sort of decided that I was a long-term person, but there are times when I think, my God, I wish I'd, become a surgeon and I could actually go home at night thinking, wow, that's good.
Yeah. Um, do you ever wish that you had stayed I mean, you just kind of thought just now but like overall, do you ever wish you'd stayed a surgeon?
There are times, but no, no, I think I'm very happy with the decision. Um, I'm one of the reasons I didn't become a surgeon was that I worked as a junior doctor for a surgeon who was extremely good.
Mm,
And I couldn't work out why he was so good. And I realized that unless I could be as good as he was, and it was a he, um, then what's the point of doing this? Um, and that was one of the reasons that I decided to leave surgery.
mm,
And I thought, um, 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 with overconfidence, that I could probably do a sort of, a decentish job as a paleoanthropologist. Um, and so that's one of the reasons why I stopped doing surgery and did paleoanthropology. And the other thing is that paleoanthropology, like a lot of academia, um, most of one's most of one's colleagues are smart, nice, decent people. We don't work in a coal mine. We work in amenable places, and so it's a very sort of many ways a comfortable way of spending your life.
mhm.
Nobody's telling you what to do from one minute to the next, and but that's the good news. The bad news is that it's sometimes very difficult to get satisfaction.
What advice could you give to both early career researchers and students who are looking to get into paleoanthropology?
Um, the well, there are two sorts of advice I might be tempted by you to give. One is if you want to choose somebody as a mentor, um, look and see what they've published and look and see who they publish with, um, and because this mentor is going to be pretty influential on your life. Um, if you have a graduate student for 5 years, you have a very close relationship with them.
Mm-hmm.
And if you drive them mad, or if they drive you mad, then that's not going to work. So be very careful about who you choose as a mentor. And the other thing is that if you're looking for a research problem, look at something that everybody thinks is decided. In other words, look at a taxonomic hypothesis that nobody queries anymore, or look at a functional hypothesis that nobody queries anymore, and go and look at it. Because in many cases, just because it's not controversial, it doesn't mean that it's been resolved or decided. So you need to choose a research question. Now, that's really difficult. And of course, as you've already uncovered, I did not choose my research question. It was actually chosen for me,
Mm-hmm.
which is why I do not like games of chance. I have no interest in playing games of chance. I don't play cards. I have no interest in playing any games of chance. Life is difficult enough as it is without inviting more difficulty by playing
Absolutely.
games of chance.
And if you had any, I think leaving this off on a place where we have discussed what is great for the next series of people entering, I just wanted to give you a moment before we sign off to just say anything that you think needs to be said about the field, want to say, or anything about where we're going as a science. Is there anything you would like to say to leave us with?
Well, I think I would say that most of the research questions which we are still trying to tackle are not new ones. I mean, the most interesting questions are the ones that have been around for a long time. What people who are coming into the field now can do is to think about those questions in a fresh way, and to maybe use lines of evidence that were not obvious to people like me, but they were there, and to have a healthy disregard for their own infallibility.
And I think those are very wise words to leave us with. Dr. Bernard Wood from George Washington University, thank you so much for coming on the show. It has been an absolute pleasure.
It was my pleasure too, and I enjoyed the conversation. And good luck to you.
Thank you.